A hand shot out from behind a stone wall and grabbed his wrist. The grip was wrong. The fingers were too short, bent at angles no healthy joint could make. He yanked back. The hand held. Then a face appeared from the shadows. The skull was narrow. The jaw hung crooked on one side. Both eyes pointed in slightly different directions. Behind that face came another. Same skull. Same jaw. Then a third. A fourth. He stopped counting at 7. They weren't attacking. They were standing. Watching. Every face carried the same broken features. The same sunken cheeks. The same twisted hands. The man being held was Dr. Victor Renard. His partner, Dr. Elise Marchetti, stood frozen 3 steps behind him. They had come looking for ruins. What they found instead would force the scientific world to confront a question nobody wanted to answer. Stay with me on this one. Now, let me take you back a few weeks before that moment. Because what Victor Renard and Elise Marchetti walked into didn't start with that hand on a wrist. It started with a rumor. A very old rumor. In 1962, Renard was 34 years old. Marchetti was 29. Both worked out of the University of Lyon, both hungry to make a name in a field that rewarded bold expeditions. And both had become obsessed with the same thing. A passage in a 200-year-old surveyor's journal, buried in the basement of a regional archive, described a settlement high in a mountain range in southern Europe. The surveyor hadn't visited it himself. He'd spoken to a goatherd who claimed there was a town beyond a narrow pass that no one could reach anymore. A series of landslides, decades earlier, had sealed the valley shut. The goatherd said smoke still rose from behind the ridge. Someone was alive in there. The surveyor noted it, moved on, and never followed up. Nobody did. For 2 centuries, that paragraph sat untouched. Renard found it in the spring of 1961. He brought it to Marchetti. She read it twice and said one word. When? They spent 8 months securing funding from the university. Not much. Enough for supplies, a mule, and a local guide who knew the lower trails. Nobody at the faculty took it seriously. Lost towns were fairy tales. But Renard had cross-referenced the surveyor's coordinates with geological records, and the landslide pattern matched. Something had sealed that valley. Whether anyone was still alive in there. That was the question. They departed in June of 1962. The first 2 days were unremarkable. Standard mountain terrain. Rocky trails. Thin air. Their guide, a man named Dukik, had spent 40 years on those mountains. He was built low and wide, barely said 10 words a day, and carried twice his share without complaint. On the 3rd morning, they passed through a small village. Renard asked if anyone had ever heard of a settlement beyond the upper passes. The villagers went quiet. One older woman crossed herself. A man behind her said there was nothing up there. He said it too quickly. That night, Dukik pulled Renard aside at camp. He told him the villages in this area had a name for the ridge above them. He translated it roughly as the closed place. Dukik said his grandfather had told him a story, that there were people living behind the mountain who had been there since before anyone could remember. People who were not right. Renard asked what not right meant. Dukik shrugged and said his grandfather wouldn't say more. He'd just tap the side of his head and shake it. Renard wrote the conversation down that night. He didn't tell Marchetti. He didn't want to bias her observations before they'd arrived. On the 5th day, the trail narrowed to almost nothing. Dukik stopped. He pointed to a rock face ahead. There was a gap. Not wide enough for the mule. Barely wide enough for a person. Renard squeezed through first. On the other side, the terrain dropped into a valley. Green. Enclosed on all sides by ridgelines. And at the bottom, roughly a mile away, he saw rooftops. Stone rooftops. Smoke rising from chimneys. He turned back to Marchetti and Dukik. His face said everything. Now here's what matters. The buildings they saw were not ruins. They weren't crumbling foundations or collapsed walls. These were standing structures. Maintained. Lived in. Marchetti later wrote in her field journal that the architecture resembled something from the mid-1700s. Thick stone. Small windows. Slate roofing. Nothing modern. Nothing from the last century. Nothing from the century before that even. It was as if time had simply stopped. They descended into the valley over the next 2 hours. And the closer they got, the quieter Dukik became. He stopped talking entirely about halfway down. When they passed a stream, Marchetti noticed something in the water. A wooden cup. Hand-carved. Simple. Old. She picked it up. The tool marks were rough. Whoever made it didn't have fine instruments. She held it up for Renard to see. He nodded. Someone was living here, and they were living simply. By the time they reached the edge of the settlement, Dukik refused to go further. He sat on a rock, pressed his palms against his knees, shook his head, and said he'd wait. His face had changed. Whatever bravery had carried him up the mountain for 5 days was gone. Renard didn't argue. He and Marchetti went in alone. The first thing they noticed wasn't the buildings. It was the silence. No animals. No dogs barking. No chickens. No voices. No tools clanking. Just wind pushing through empty streets. Then a shutter moved on a window to their left. Someone was watching. They walked further. Another shutter. Then a door cracked open ahead of them. A figure stood in the doorway. Short. Thin. Head slightly too large for the body. Hands folded in a way that looked unnatural, like the fingers didn't bend the right way. And then the figure stepped into the light, and Marchetti stopped walking. Because behind that first figure, more peered. From doorways, from alleys, from behind walls. All of them watching, and all of them, every single one, looked almost identical. That's when the hand grabbed Renard's wrist. And this is where the story changes from an archaeological expedition into something much darker. Believe me, what they saw in that town was unsettling. But what they learned over the next 48 hours was worse. The townspeople didn't attack. They didn't run. They gathered. Slowly, carefully, the way people do when they haven't seen a stranger in a very long time. An older man pushed through the crowd. He was shorter than Renard by a full head. His back was hunched. His left hand was missing 2 fingers. But his eyes were sharp. He spoke. The language was close enough to an old regional dialect that Marchetti could follow about half of it. Took time. Gestures. Repetition. But within an hour she understood enough. His name was Boyan. He was the town's elder. And he welcomed them. Boyan brought them to the largest building at the center of the settlement. It served as a town hall and a meeting place. Inside, Marchetti found what would become the most important part of the entire expedition. Records. Handwritten ledgers. Birth records. Marriage records. Death records. Going back generations. She started reading, and what those pages revealed made her put the first ledger down and sit in silence for a long time. The town had been sealed off by landslides sometime around 1740. Give or take a decade. The records weren't precise in the early years. What was precise, painfully precise, was everything that followed. At the time of the landslides, roughly 60 people lived in the valley. They had enough arable land to grow food. A stream ran through the center for water. They could survive, but they couldn't leave, and no one could get in. So they did what any small population does when it has no outside contact. They married within the group. First cousins at first, then closer. By the 3rd generation, the family names in the ledgers had collapsed from 12 to 5. By the 5th generation, 3. By the 7th, the records showed marriages between individuals who shared the same grandparents on both sides. Now here's what makes this so devastating. Marchetti understood genetics well enough to know what she was reading. When closely related people have children, recessive genes that would normally stay hidden get expressed. 1 generation, you might see a slightly higher rate of certain conditions. 2 generations, it increases. But 10 generations. 10 generations of a closed population that started with only 60 people. That's not a gradual decline. That's a collapse. Each pairing stacks the damage higher. Each child inherits a narrower and narrower slice of the original gene pool. By the time you reach the 8th, 9th, 10th generation, the genetic diversity is so low that the body starts failing in ways that compound on each other. Marchetti counted it out. 10 generations. Roughly 220 years. And with each generation, the medical notes in the margins grew longer. Clubbed feet, shortened fingers, jaw deformities, vision loss, hearing problems, seizures, stillbirths. The numbers climbed with every decade. She showed Renard. He flipped through 3 ledgers in silence. Then he looked around at the people in the room, at their hands, their faces, the way some of them tilted their heads to hear better out of one ear. He understood. Every single person in this town was related to every other person. Not distantly, closely. Genetically, they were practically one family, and the physical cost was written on their bodies. But here's the thing. That night, Boyan fed them. Bread. A thin stew. Some kind of root vegetable Marchetti didn't recognize. The food was simple but warm. They sat by a fire in the town hall. The townspeople lingered nearby, curious but not threatening. Boyan even smiled once or twice. Renard pulled out his notebook and began sketching a preliminary map of the settlement. Marchetti organized her notes. They talked quietly about the next steps. Return to the university. Assemble a proper team. Geneticists, physicians, anthropologists. This was the discovery of a lifetime. Not ruins. Not artifacts. A living population, isolated for over 2 centuries, preserved in time. They felt safe. They even felt lucky. Marchetti wrote in her journal that night, "We may have found the most significant anthropological site of the 20th century. She was right about that, but she was wrong about feeling safe." A scream cut through the silence before dawn. Sharp. "Hi." A child's voice. Renard was on his feet before he was fully awake. Marchetti grabbed the lantern. They followed the sound across the town square to a low stone building they hadn't entered yet. The door was open. Inside, a girl, maybe 13 or 14 years old, stood pressed against a wall. 2 older women held her arms. A man stood opposite, his hands at his sides. The girl was crying. Not quietly. She was fighting, kicking, trying to pull free. The man just stood there, waiting. Boyan appeared behind Renard. He spoke quickly. Marchetti caught fragments. She translated for Renard, and her voice went flat. "It's a pairing," she said. "They're assigning her a husband." The man standing across from the girl was at least 40. And according to what Marchetti could piece together from the ledgers, he was also her uncle. Now, this is where it turns. Because up until that moment, Renard and Marchetti were scientists. Observers. They documented. They recorded. They didn't interfere. That's what you're trained to do. You study. You don't change the thing you're studying. But Renard looked at that girl. 13 years old, maybe 14. Held in place by 2 women. Being handed to a man twice her age. A man who shared her bloodline. And something in him shifted. He said no. Not loudly. Not aggressively. Just, no. He said it in French, which nobody understood, and then he said it again using the few words of the local dialect he'd picked up. The room went still. Boyan stared at him. The 2 women stared at him. Even the girl stopped struggling and looked at him. Nobody had ever said no before. Renard stepped forward. He put himself between the girl and the man. And that was when the nature of the whole situation changed. Because Boyan's face shifted. The warmth was gone. The hospitality. The curiosity. All of it. Gone. He spoke one sentence to Marchetti. She translated it. He says we don't understand. He says the pairings keep the town alive. Without them, there are no children. Without children, the town dies. Renard didn't move. He could feel the tension in the room changing. The 2 women still held the girl's arms. The man across from him hadn't stepped back. And behind him, Marchetti could hear movement. More people gathering in the doorway. Word had spread fast. An outsider was interfering with a pairing. Marchetti counted 6 men now standing behind Boyan. None of them were large. None of them were strong by any standard Renard would have recognized. But there were 6 of them. And there was one of him. Marchetti stepped in. She didn't challenge Boyan directly. She asked him to show her more of the records. The recent ones. The last 2 generations. She spoke carefully, calmly. like a person trying to redirect a conversation away from a cliff edge. Boyan hesitated. He looked at the men behind him. Then he looked at the girl still pinned against the wall. Then he agreed. The girl was released. Not freed. Released for now. The pairing wasn't cancelled. It was postponed. Marchetti knew the difference. But it bought them time. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button. Because what those records showed was far worse than anything Renard and Marchetti had imagined. The birth and death ledgers for the last 2 generations told a simple, brutal story. More than half the children born in the last 30 years had died before the age of 5. Of those who survived, nearly all showed significant physical deformity. Shortened limbs, fused fingers, spinal curvature. Several were blind. A few could not speak. The marriages, the pairings, were becoming tighter, not wider. The pool was shrinking, and the results were accelerating. Marchetti found one entry that stopped her cold. A pairing between a brother and sister, documented plainly, 10 years earlier. 3 children were born. 1 survived. The surviving child had a note beside her name. 1 word. A local term Marchetti didn't recognize at first. She asked Boyan. He paused before answering. Then he pointed. Across the room, sitting in a corner, was a young woman. Maybe 18. She sat perfectly still. Her eyes didn't track movement. Her hands were curled against her chest. She made no sound. She hadn't moved in the entire time Renard and Marchetti had been in the room. Boyan said the word again. Marchetti realized it meant the quiet ones. And there were more. She asked how many. Boyan held up both hands. Then held them up again. 20. At least 20 people in this town who couldn't walk, couldn't speak, couldn't care for themselves. Hidden in back rooms. Kept alive but kept out of sight. The town had around 90 people total. 20 of them were severely impaired. That's more than 1 in 5. And among the youngest generation, the ones under 15, the ratio was even worse. Nearly half of the children born in the last decade had significant disabilities. The town was producing more people who needed care than people who could provide it. Marchetti ran the numbers in her head and felt something close to vertigo. This wasn't a stable population declining slowly. This was a system in freefall. Renard asked to see them. Boyan refused. Not with hostility. With something worse. Shame. He knew. He had always known what the pairings were doing. He just didn't know what else to do. The town had no other option. No new people. No new blood. The only way to produce the next generation was with the people they had. And every generation the cost got higher. Marchetti pulled Renard aside. She told him what she had calculated. At the current rate of decline, the town had maybe 2 more generations before it became unviable. The genetic damage was too severe. The infant mortality too high. Within 40 to 50 years, there wouldn't be enough healthy people to sustain the population. The town was dying. It had been dying for 100 years. It just hadn't stopped moving yet. Renard wanted to help. He wanted to bring doctors, geneticists, resources, but Marchetti raised the harder question. And then what? Relocate them? Into a world they've never seen? They don't know what a car is. They don't know what a telephone is. Their language is 2 centuries old. You drop them into 1962, and you destroy them just as surely as the inbreeding will. That's the dilemma, and it had no clean answer. But then came the part that made the decision for them. That evening, Renard went for a walk along the edge of the settlement. He found a low stone structure near the valley wall. Half buried. Older than the rest of the buildings. He pushed the door open. Inside on the floor were bones. Human bones. Not arranged. Not buried. Piled. Dozens of skulls. Maybe more. He called Marchetti. She came with the lantern. They counted. At least 30 sets of remains. The bones were old but not ancient. Some still had fragments of clothing. And here's what made Renard's stomach turn. Mixed in with the bones were items that didn't belong to the town. A compass with German markings. A leather satchel with brass buckles. A boot with a rubber sole. Rubber soles didn't exist in the 1700s. These were outsiders. People who had found the valley just like Renard and Marchetti had. And none of them had left. Renard went back to Boyan. He didn't ask politely this time. He described what he'd found. Boyan didn't deny it. He said that, over the generations, a handful of people had stumbled into the valley. Travelers, hunters, lost hikers, maybe a dozen over 2 centuries. And every time, the council had made the same decision. The outsiders could not leave. If they left, they would bring others. And others would destroy the town. So the outsiders stayed. Some were absorbed into the community, paired with locals. Their genes added to the pool. Those ones actually helped. The generations that followed mixed pairings showed fewer deformities. The council knew this. They understood, in their own way, that new blood made stronger children. But they couldn't control who wandered in. And they couldn't let anyone wander out. The ones who resisted. The ones who tried to leave. The ones who fought. Boyan stopped talking. He didn't need to finish. The bone room finished the sentence for him. Renard felt the ground shift under him. Not the physical ground. The understanding of where he stood. This was not an anthropological site. This was not a discovery to be documented and published. This was a cage. And he was inside it. He looked at Marchetti. She looked back. They both understood. They were not guests. They were prisoners who hadn't been told yet. And the council was already deciding what to do with them. Marchetti had noticed it throughout the day. The glances between the older men. The way Boyan kept finding reasons to know where they were. The fact that Dukik, their guide, had not come down into the valley. He was still sitting on that rock at the top of the pass. If he was still there at all. They made a plan that night. No notes. No whispers. Just eye contact and small gestures while sitting by the fire, pretending to review their journals. Marchetti had noticed something during her exploration of the valley's edge. On the north side, where the oldest landslide had sealed the pass, centuries of weather and erosion had opened a gap. Not the one they'd come through. A different one. Narrow. Steep. Possibly impassable. But possibly not. They waited until the deepest part of the night. The town had no electric light. No lanterns on the streets. When the fires went out, the darkness was total. Renard packed his satchel with the most critical journals and notes. Marchetti took her own field journal and the small camera she'd been using to document the settlement. They left everything else. The tent. The cooking equipment. The mule was still at the top of the main pass with Dukik. They had nothing but what they could carry. They moved along the valley wall, staying low, feeling their way by touch. Every sound felt enormous. A loose stone under Renard's boot. Marchetti's sleeve brushing against a wall. At one point, a door creaked somewhere behind them. They froze. 10 seconds. 20. Nothing. They kept going. It took over an hour to reach the north gap. It was tighter than Marchetti had estimated. The opening was barely 2 feet wide at the base and narrowed further as it climbed. At one point, Renard had to remove his pack and push it ahead of him through a space barely wider than his shoulders. He exhaled completely to fit through one section where the rock pinched inward. Marchetti scraped her hands raw against the stone. Her palms were bleeding by the time she pulled herself through the last narrow stretch. But they kept going. Behind them, the town was silent. No shouts. No torches. No pursuit. Nobody had noticed. Not yet. They cleared the gap just before dawn. On the other side, the mountain opened into a steep but navigable slope. The air felt different. Thinner. Cleaner. Like something had been lifted off their chests. They descended for 6 hours without stopping. Neither spoke. There was nothing to say that their legs weren't already saying. Get down. Get out. Don't stop. By midday, they hit a trail Renard recognized from their initial ascent. By evening, they reached the village where they'd hired Dukik. He was there, sitting in the same tavern where they'd first met him. He looked at them like he was seeing ghosts. He didn't ask what they'd found. He already knew something. The locals had always known something was up there. They just never went looking. Renard and Marchetti contacted the university the next morning. Within 2 weeks, a team was assembled. Not just archaeologists this time. Physicians. A geneticist from Paris. 2 government officials from the Regional Health Authority. They went back up the mountain, this time with proper equipment, radios, medical supplies, and authorization to intervene if necessary. What they found was cooperation. Mostly, Boyan met them at the gap. He didn't fight. He didn't block the entrance. He looked tired. He looked relieved. The medical team spent 3 weeks in the valley. They examined every person. They documented the genetic damage, shortened limbs, organ deficiencies, cognitive impairment. The youngest generation was the worst. Children who could not stand. Teenagers who could not form complete sentences. A birth defect rate that the geneticist later described in his report as incompatible with long-term population survival. The question Marchetti had asked in the valley hung over every decision. What do you do with these people? You can't leave them. The town will be gone in 2 generations. But you can't simply extract them. They know nothing of the outside world. The language barrier alone would take years to bridge. And the trauma of relocation, for people who had never seen a paved road or heard an engine, could be as devastating as the conditions they were leaving behind. The compromise was slow and imperfect. Over the following 3 years, a small medical outpost was established at the edge of the valley. Doctors rotated in and out on 3-month shifts. A translator was hired, a linguistics student who spent 6 months learning the town's dialect well enough to communicate clearly. The most severe medical cases, mostly children, were transported to hospitals in the lowlands. Some adapted. Many didn't. One boy, 7 years old, had never heard music before. When a nurse turned on a radio in his hospital room, he screamed and covered his ears. It took weeks before he could tolerate the sound of a car passing outside his window. A few of the younger adults, the ones with milder impairment, chose to leave on their own. They were placed in supervised housing in a nearby town. They struggled with everything. The noise, the crowds, the speed. One woman refused to eat for 3 days because she didn't recognize any of the food. Another kept trying to walk back toward the mountains. She'd get a few miles out of town before someone brought her back. One young man, barely 20, returned to the valley after 4 months. He said the outside world hurt his eyes. He meant that in every way a person can mean it. Boyan died in 1965. He never left the valley. In his final months, he told Marchetti something she recorded in her journal but never published. He said the council had voted on the night Renard and Marchetti arrived. The vote was on whether to let them leave. It was split, 4-3, in favor of letting them go. By 1 vote. One single vote was the margin between Renard and Marchetti walking out of that valley and ending up in the bone room with the others. Marchetti published her findings in 1967. The paper ran to over 100 pages. It covered the genetic data, the medical assessments, the historical records, and the ethical questions the expedition had raised. It was a landmark in human genetics and the ethics of isolated populations. It was also controversial. Some colleagues accused her of sensationalism. Others said she should have reported the town to authorities immediately instead of documenting it first. A geneticist in London called the paper the most important case study in human population genetics since the founding of the discipline. A philosopher in Berlin called it a moral indictment of every researcher who observes suffering and calls it data. Marchetti responded to neither. The paper raised questions that are still debated today. About intervention, about cultural preservation, about the line between respecting autonomy and preventing harm, about whether a community has the right to destroy itself if it chooses to, about whether outsiders have the obligation to intervene when they can see the destruction happening. But for Marchetti and Renard, the academic legacy was never the point. Renard gave one interview about the expedition in 1970. He was asked what he remembered most. He didn't mention the records or the deformities or the bone room. He talked about the girl, the 13-year-old in the stone building, held by 2 women, being handed to a man she didn't choose. He said he could still feel the moment his body moved before his mind decided. The moment he stepped between them and said no. He said that was the only moment in the entire expedition where he was certain he did the right thing. Everything else, the intervention, the relocation, the slow dissolution of the town, He wasn't sure about any of it. He said, "We found a place where people survived the only way they could. And we told them their way of surviving was killing them. That's a terrible thing to be right about. The valley is empty now. The last residents left in the early 1970s. The buildings still stand. The stone holds up. The roofs have collapsed in places. The records Marchetti found are preserved in a university archive in Lyon. The bone room was excavated. 43 sets of remains were recovered. Some were identified through the town's own records. Others never were. Nobody built a monument. Nobody named a street. The town existed for over 2 centuries and vanished without leaving a mark on any map. But it left a mark on the 2 people who found it. Renard never led another expedition. Marchetti continued her research for another 30 years, but she never returned to the valley. When asked why, she said something that Renard would have understood. She said, "I've already seen what happens when a world gets too small. I don't need to see it twice." And that firsthand. The one that grabbed Renard's wrist in the shadows. It belonged to a man named Alan. He was 26 years old when Renard met him. His fingers were short and crooked because his parents were first cousins and his grandparents were siblings. He had never seen a person from outside the valley in his entire life. When he grabbed Renard's wrist, he wasn't threatening him. He was touching him, feeling something he had never felt before, a hand that was shaped differently from his own, a hand from a world he didn't know existed. Alan was one of the people who chose to leave. He was relocated to a small town near the coast. He learned enough of the modern language to hold a basic conversation. He got a job sweeping floors in a warehouse. He lived alone. He never married. He never went back. He died in 1989 at the age of 53. The cause of death was a heart defect present from birth. One he shared with almost everyone who had ever lived in that valley. One that 10 generations of isolation had made certain he would carry. And one that no amount of distance from that valley could undo.